So it's my privilege to open this second session of this day in memory of and in honor of Shaul Shaked. I want to say just 2 or 3 sentences about Shaul. He was a friend, a good friend, and a close colleague. But Shaul was also, for all of us, and by all of us I mean the Iranists, of course, the Arabists, the Syncretists and Indologists, the Judaicists, the Semiticists, the linguists, the scholars of late antiquity, historians of religion. I could actually go on with this list. For all of us, he was our teacher. Whether we studied formally with Shaul or not, he taught us and we were his students, and we are still his students. Aside from being a great friend and colleague, Shaul was an exemplary model of humanistic scholarship at its best. He had the passion for discovering the truth. He had the very broad intellectual horizons, and he had a depth of often unconventional and penetrating insight. Actually, when I think of humanistic scholarship in this generation, Shaul is the true exemplar. He also embodied the spirit of the Institute of Asian and African Studies in a generation in which many wonderful things were happening in the Institute. And that spirit, I'm happy to say, is still alive and well at the Hebrew University. His absence, it's a year now to the day, his absence leaves a gap that can never be filled. Let me introduce the next presentation. It is a joint presentation. Once again, it'll be in a recorded version, so we will not be able to ask questions. This is the lecture, joint lecture by Professor Anca from the CNRS and the Université PCL in Paris. Anca is a classicist, very wide-ranging classicist, and a great epigraphist. And with her today is Professor Frantz Grenet. He sits on the chair of pre-Islamic history and pre-Islamic cultures of Central Asia in the Collège de France. He's an Iranist of international reputation, one of the most important in this generation. He was the director of the archaeological excavations in Samarkand. He has published widely on Sogdiana and the Tarim Basin and many other topics. And today, they will together be speaking about Irano-Judaica on Central Asian silverware, Greco-Roman topics adapted.
First, Anca and I would like to express our warm thanks to the organizers of this conference, to which I very much regret not to have been able to take part in person. And we hope our contribution will not be unworthy of the huge gratitude we have to Shaul for his many inspiring works, to which I became acquainted about more than 30 years ago when we first met and worked together in the Corpus Inscriptionum Iranicarum, to which he remained a member to the end. The title of our paper is, of course, a reference to the series Irano-Judaica, of which Shaul Shaked edited the first issue in 1984. More generally, this is one of the themes which occupied him all along his prolific career. Perhaps his ideas about the decisive influence of Zoroastrianism on post-exilic Judaism found their clearest and sharpest expression in his article Iranian Influence on Judaism, 1st century BCE to 2nd century CE, a chapter in the Cambridge History of Judaism, published also in 1984. Despite some criticisms, he never repudiated these ideas, and on the contrary, he used any opportunity to substantiate them. Also, one has to mention his considerable contribution to the study of Jewish seals in the Sasanian Empire and of the magic boards, of which one component was Jewish. In the continuity of Shaul Shaket's work, today we would like to mention and sometimes comment some documents from pre-Islamic or early Islamic Central Asia, which shed light on the antiquity and social influence of Jewish communities in these regions. Some of these documents appeared recently, some were known for a long time and have been recently submitted to fresh examination. Some are textual, others are archaeological. Among textual documents, the corpus of Judeo-Persian letters from Khotan has been increased by a second specimen, which confirms the participation of the Khotan Jews in the king's private business, as well as a Sogdian linguistic and cultural heritage. Indeed, they are probably contemporary with an inscription in Square Hebrew found together with the Sogdian inscriptions and petroglyphs in the upper Indus Valley. These inscriptions was re-edited by Shaul Shaket. More to the west, in the depth of the Hindu Kush Mountains, the 11th-12th century tombstones from Firuzko, and even more, the slightly earlier Bamiyan Geniza, studied by Shaul Shaket and Ophir Haim, unexpectedly vindicate some apparently strange statements by Benjamin of Tudela about the prosperity of Jewish communities in these mountainous regions, their investment in agricultural activities, the presence of Levites, and at time, their political autonomy. The earliest precise data on Jewish communities in Central Asia dates from the 4th century AD, with a visit in Merv of the Amora Shemuel Bar Bisena, recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, which hints at the questionable orthopraxy of these co-religions. Later on in the Sasanian period, still in Merv, we have the only pre-Islamic Jewish burials so far attested. 5 ossuaries bearing Jewish names inscribed in Aramaic, and another one, a painted motif which can be interpreted as Jewish, the dove with the olive branch, were found in a large multi-roomed naus, a type of bone repository used also by the local Zoroastrians. The problem is that this naus functioned during several centuries, and the unmistakable Jewish ossuaries are just a few among hundreds of individuals, either in ossuaries, bone pits, or as full bodies. This has led Michael Shenkar to question the label Jewish Collective Mausoleum I have proposed for it. If the Jewish community in Merv shared the same monument and even the same chambers as the local, presumably Zoroastrian community, this would indeed be a remarkable and probably unique sign of integration. While admitting that Shenkar's doubts can be seriously contemplated, especially considering the fact that this monument was very poorly excavated and published in the 1950s, I would like to suggest that some objections are not fully valid. The alleged variety of funeral practices, some with the full body and others with the collection of excarnated bones, is perhaps illusory, as I tried to demonstrate already in 1984. In this case, as well as in many other funeral places in Central Asia, it could just represent 2 successive phases of the process, the exposure to flesh-eating animals in dharmas being far from generalized even among Zoroastrians. If so, the first phase of the process, before the gathering of the bones, would have been, so to speak, frozen during the 2 phases of reconstruction of the monument. Also, the exclusive destination of an house to a specific religious community is not unparalleled. An house at Misdar Khan in Khorezm was reserved for the Christian community, which had also adopted the ossuaries. Lastly, I would like to mention that the Merv repository provided one of the very rare instances of objects deposited together with excarnated bones, weaver's weights, and a miniature copper crucible. They might indicate the profession of the deceased. One of the phases of the Merv sepulchre coincided with the period of the domination of the Hephthalites Huns, and this brings us to the core of our presentation. It is hardly by coincidence that the main Jewish communities which surged in our documentation shortly after the Islamic conquest were situated in places which in the 5th and 6th centuries had belonged to the Hephthalite Empire. Merv, Herat, the central Hindu Kush, Maimana called Al-Yahudiya, Balkh. Byzantine historical records offer an eloquent contemporary confirmation of the Hephthalite cradle of these communities. Agatias, instead of writing Hephthalitai, writes Nephtalitai, a spelling reproduced by later authors, Pseudo-Mauritius, Theophanes Confessor, Michael Ataliades, and Georgios Kedouenos. In doing so, they introduced the theme of the lost tribes of Israel settled in Khurasan, a theme echoed by Benjamin of Tudela and apparently still claimed by the Afghan Amir Dost Muhammad when he spoke with British envoys.
Benjamin of Tudela identifies the Jews in China, for him the land of Sinin from Isaiah 49:11, as Rechabites. This goes back to another ancient Jewish tradition about the lost tribes in the Far East. The narration of Zosimus, a Greek Christian text, equally known from Syriac, Arabic, Armenian, Georgian, or Slavonic versions, includes a history of the Rechabites, inspired from Jeremiah 35. The Rechabites, who refused wine and sedentary life, became the blessed wise men living as ascetic, in a happy life, in a primitive nature that offered everything by itself. Wearing no clothes and eating only fruits, the Rechabites took the place of the Indian gymnosophists on the eastern edge of the known world. The history of the Rechabites must be a Jewish story, which certainly predates the 5th century CE, when it was already echoed by Commodian, a Christian Latin poet from Africa, mentioning the idealized life of the Jews living beyond Persia and the Sabbath River. In fact, not only the history of the Rechabites, but the whole narration of Zosimus was sometimes supposed to be a Christian interpretation of a Jewish philosophical travel to the land of the blessed, analogous to Apollonius of Tyana's travel by Philostratus in antiquity, or to St. Brendan's travel in the Middle Ages. Guided by an animal and by 2 speaking trees on the shore of the ocean, Zosimus recalls Alexander the Great traveling to the oracle of the sun and of the moon and meeting the blessed gymnosophists. We have now a proof that the Jewish Alexander was told to have traveled to the land of the blessed at the eastern end of the world. This proof is a Central Asiatic silverware, a Bactrian silver bowl discovered in Tibet, but made in Bactria in the 6th century of our era, therefore after the invention of the Rechabite history, under the Hephthalite Huns. On this silver bowl, now exposed in Tokyo, we have recognized Alexander the Great as one knows him from many copies of his portrait by Lysippos. The bowl belongs now to a private owner in Japan who displays it in the Ancient Orient Museum in Tokyo. David Snellgrove, professor of Tibetan Buddhist studies in London, obtained it in 1961 from a member of an old aristocratic family in Lhasa, who declared it a generations-old family heirloom. The ball is shaped as a calotte cup, 6 centimeters high, with a rim diameter of 21 centimeters. Its height is 1 kilogram and 130 grams. Thanks to the works of Nicholas Sims Williams, we know that this weight corresponds to 250 drachms, according to a standard unit of 4.5 grams, well attested in Bactria and Sagdiana. As this standard could not be known before Sims Williams' research, and given the round number of local drachms used for this base, we exclude all suspicion that the object is a fake. The interior surface is smooth, the exterior is fully decorated with carved reliefs projecting up to 9 millimeters outside the wall. Philip Denwood published it in 1973 while it was on loan in the Ashmolean Museum. It considered it to be a Greek representation of a scene in the Iliad, in the Song 2, verses 303-330. This is about the famous tragedy at Aulis before the Achaeans, the Greeks, embarked to the Trojan War. And this tragedy announced the time of the war as being a lapse of 9 years. This interpretation of this ball is impossible, because in the tragedy, one should have seen a plane tree and 8 fledglings plus their mother, which cannot be found on this ball. None of the participants in the Aulis scene, so Calchas, the priest, Agamemnon, the warriors, and Ulysses, can be recognized on our ball. So let's go back to the ball and see the details of its description. The base is occupied by a medallion showing a round pool with 6 fishes which are swimming. On the body of the ball, we see 6 characters, in fact only 4, 2 being duplicated. They carry various objects and each acts in relationship to a tree with multiple and twisted branches. The trees have 3 oversized flowers that we recognize as Boswellia serrata, in Sanskrit Salaki, the tree or bush that produces Indian frankincense, most frequently known as kundura. The resin exudes from the bark, solidifies, and is collected in the shape of small balls. The birds, which nourish themselves with the nectar of the salaki, despite the dangers of snakes, are from a paradisiacal species, like the Nectarinidae. The purple sunbird, Cinyris asiaticus, who lives between southern Iran and India, could fit this image because it measures only 10 centimeters. Male and female hatch the eggs in their nest together, as we can see it on the ball, and the colors also feel this metallic aspect of our silver alloyed of copper and silver ball. Stories of snakes guarding aromatics in faraway countries were often told by the Greeks, and often they involved also paradisiac birds, and they are a common place in Sanskrit tales as well as in Chinese and Arabic accounts on India. Among the 4 characters, a bare-chested young man wears an Indian dhoti. You can see it here to the right. On his right shoulder, he carries a small table amphora with a high, narrow neck, a fluted body, and a flat foot. Similar species of 20 centimeters high, albeit rare, are known in Penjiken, probably inspired by late Roman amphora or rather amphoriscoi, some of them of blown glass. It is such a Roman blown glass that we consider to be as the closest parallel for the model of this vase. It is dated to the 3rd or the 4th century. The carrier on the ball recovers the mouth of the amphora with his hand, which indicates that it is full of a precious liquid. The second male figure beats a drum and directs his piercing gaze towards the snake and the nest in the tree. He wears a full tunic and is trampling the ground in order to add some vibrations, a motion which is visible at the end of its tunic. The drum, held firmly under his left arm, is biconical with a lozenge network of strings that the musician pinches with his hand. The stick is long, thick, slightly curved, and rounded at the end. This shape of drum is sometimes depicted on Sasanian and Bactrian silverware, like this Stroganov bowl, but is more typical of India. In the Punjab, it is known as the dol. Consequently, this character can be identified as an Indian musician or a priest musician who diverts the snake from the collectors of aromatics, or from the fledglings, or from both. The priest musician, in fact, has a large hairy appendix on the right side of his shaven head, comparable with the shika, a tuft of hair still worn at the back or on the side of the shaved skull by some Brahmanic castes in southern India. But the character's face seems grotesque, with round eyes, set folds of skins, and protruding nose and lips, rather evocative of a monstrous creature, like ape-like features. We are inclined to recognize him as a fictional creature with a fully human body, but a head inspired by a cynocephalus. This cynocephalus in antiquity for the Greeks was a baboon. In this case, the cynocephalus baboon could be mixed with the type of an Indian makat drummer, more familiar in India, Bactria, and Sogdiana, as exemplified by the musician on the Stroganov board. In the main scene, there are two nude males standing on either side of a tree. Only the one to the left of the tree is repeated elsewhere in the ring composition. Except for a scarf and a cloak, each man is nude and stands so that one can see that they are circumcised. You can see here the three pictures with the circumcision, which is a unique feature in classical as well as in Iranian and Central Asian art. The young man on the right holds a sack in his hand. You can see it here also to the right, and is about to collect the resin of the incense tree, which actually exudes from an incision in reality. His wide flopping cloak with fan-shaped folds derived from the Greek chlamys, but with a knot instead of a fibula, is associated in Central Asia with deities, as on this Ishtikhan oswald, which offers us a clue for the paradisiac identification of the scene. Indeed, two characters facing each other on both sides of a tree necessarily recalls the stereotype of the Garden of Eden on the Roman representations of Adam and Eve, but also of the two spouses in the Zoroastrian paradise. The young man to the left holds a kind of bottle while lifting a cup in his right hand. The bottle is well known in late antiquity as a pilgrim bottle, used to carry holy water. Mold-blown flagons are known from layers of the 4th century CE Egypt. Most probably, the young man uses the bottle to sprinkle a liquid. The other vessel, a cup, is raised to the level of the mouth, obviously in order to drink. The two men in mirror recalls the telescopic compositions, well known in Roman and then in Christian art, where a character is facing himself in two successive scenes. This device is also known at Panjikent, in the painting of the goose with the golden eggs. On our Lhasa bowl, the two characters have short and abundant hair, with some locks raised above the middle of their foreheads, so the anastole. This feature, as well as the delineation of the faces and the heroic nudity, definitely points to Alexander. Therefore, in the main scene, we recognize two episodes of legends about Alexander the Great, both situated in some sort of paradise, called already Paradisos, Paradisum, in the recension Alpha of the Alexander Romans in the 1st century CE. These stories circulated independently but were reunited in a text exactly like on our bowl in the 5th century CE in the recension Beta of the Alexander Romans. To the right, Alexander is plucking the incense tree, and we find the details in the letter to Aristotle about the miracles of India, where we also discovered the cynocephalus a priest who guides Alexander to the oracle, which will reveal him the end of his days. To the left of the picture, Alexander drinking the water of life is an episode which appears nowhere as such in the literary tradition, except in some analogous form, in some close form, in the Babylonian Talmud. I'm reading from Tamid 32b. When he took himself and went on his way, he sat at a certain spring and was eating bread. He had salted fish in his hands, and while he cleansed them of their excessive salt, a particularly pleasant fragrance fell upon them. Alexander said to himself, I may conclude from this event that this spring comes from the Garden of Eden. There are those who say, so says the commentator in the Tamid. Some says he took from those water and washed his face. And there are in other variants, who says he ascended along the length of the entire spring until he reached the entrance to the Garden of Eden. He raised a loud voice, calling out, "Open the gate for me." The sentry of the Garden of Eden said to him, "This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter into it." Moreover, as we have already said, on our ball, Alexander is circumcised. A legend attested much later in a 14th century romance in Hebrew mentions the circumcision of Alexander before entering the Eden Garden, a circumcision which is carefully marked 3 times on the ball, as you can see again here. I'm reading again the text. They set forth from there, and arriving at the land of Euphrates, the king ordered wells dug in the vicinity of the river, and much water was found, and the king and his men drank. On the 10th day, the king's hunter caught some birds. So the salt fishes are now replaced by birds, and both are present on our bowl. Wrung their necks and washed them in the waters of the river of the Euphrates. As he dipped them in and washed them in waters of the rivers, they returned to life and fled away. Seeing this, the king's servant quickly drank from the river and went to the king to tell him all that happened. "Obviously, these are the waters of the Garden of Eden," said the king. "Whoever drinks from them shall live forever. Go quickly and fetch me some, and I too shall drink." The servant hastened, cup in hand, to bring some of those water to him, but he could not find them anymore. He returned and told the king, "I could not find the waters of the rivers, for the Lord has hidden them from me." The king grew angry, drew his sword, and beheaded his servant. Then the headless servant ran away, and Menahem, the secretary, related. Our sages says that he is still headless in the sea, where he overturns the ships. We have here a Byzantine motif of a demon of the seas. Menahem explained this to the king, who said, "Apparently, this is the gate of the Garden of Eden." Then he cried out, "Who is upon this gate?" A voice called back, "This is the gate of the Garden of Eden, and no heathen or uncircumcised male may enter." That night, Alexander was circumcised, and his physicians came and immediately healed him with beneficial herbs. Nothing of this was known in the camp, for the king ordered his physicians to keep silent. Next day, the king cried out to the keepers of the gate, "Give me a tribute, and I will go on my way." Our Bactrian ball is not only a proof that Jews could have invented the circumcision of Alexander long before the Middle Ages. Just like in the history of the Rechabites related to the Alexander Romans, this ball shows the contribution of Judaism to the transcultural invention of the earthly paradise. And this is not the only case. A bronze plateau from Berlin, dated to the 8th century CE, at the beginning of the Islamic period, can be interpreted as another illustration of a Jewish paradise. This time, the celestial house of the Lord. The plateau is in bronze and has about 64 centimeters in diameter. And it is engraved on the whole inner surface. The decoration, as you can see, is radial, made of arcane arches, which are alternately filled with various flowers and palmettes. Above a large pair of wings, common in Sasanian art, there is a kind of palace with a row of arcades that you can see here, a crenellated roof, and domes. In the middle, there is a striking single column. This recalls, of course, the representation of some idealized palaces in paradises in the Roman and Sasanian art. And this is also the interpretation of the Uppsala school, and in particular Ringbaum, who had seen here a representation of the Zoroastrian paradise. However, it is important to look at the numbers of figures on this vase. The house has in front of it 2 trees. And it is true that this could correspond to the 2 Zoroastrian trees of all seeds and to the tree Gokar, used in the preparation of the resurrection dream. Nonetheless, the 2 trees could also be the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad from the Garden of Eden. What encourages us to recognize a Jewish background for this vase is the number of 10 arcades or gates in the palace. They should represent the 10 Sephirot, the 10 commandments of the Lord, the 10 possibilities to entry to the Lord. More interestingly, there are 22 radial paths or petals which bring the view to this central palace. Each one is different in its design if there is a succession, an alternation of regular, rectangular, and round patterns. This recalls the 22 letters of the alphabet. These are the paths of wisdom through which God made the world in the book of creation, Sefer Yetzirah, supposed to have been composed in Talmudic period, probably sometimes before the 7th century, and maybe in the East. The whole design recalls the description of the eternal palace of being, Adonai Shammah, in Ezekiel's vision of the Day of Atonement, in particular for the trees, this exuberant vegetation that you can see all around the palace. In the context of the late antique Judaism, we have to understand that the iconoclastic commandment was not applied very strictly, and the house of the Lord could be represented on such a vase, as we can see representation of the temple, of symbols of the temples in other contexts on Jewish mosaics or on talismanic plaques. It is true, however, that the bronze plate representation remains dependent on its Iranian context, as we can see from the comparison with another Sasanian plate representing the Senmur on this Sasanian plate, so from Bolshoi Neanikov, now in the Hermitage. We see also here the 2 trees, this time Zoroastrians. But this is not, of course, the motif is Zoroastrian, and the number of the flowers of the motifs around has no numerological significations, unlike on the Berlin plate. We close our presentation with the invitation to reconsider 2 or rather 3 other Sasanian plates considered until now as being Christians of Nestorian, but which could go back to Jewish models if they are not Jewish themselves. The first case is the one of the almost identical plates from Anikovka and from Nildino, made in the 9th-10th century CE after an 8th century model, and representing the fall of Jericho according to the book of Joshua 6, as established by Boris Marshak by comparison with Panjikan representations of warriors. On the plates, one recognizes the sun and the moon up here, the Ark of the Covenant in the middle, and the 7 priests with their trumpets, which made the walls of Jericho fall. Behind the closed gates of the city, one sees the prostitute Rahab, who will be saved. Jericho is depicted as a typical Sogdian stronghold, including those, the stronghold in Semirechye, now in Kyrgyzstan, where Marshak located the fabrication of the model of this plate in an Nestorian Christian context. Because at his time, at the time when Marshak did the research, there was no knowledge about a Jewish presence before or in the early days of the Islamic era. None of the two plates, however, contain a Christian symbol. On the contrary, the Anikovka plate has on the shield of the victorious king, which is represented up the city, a lily flower, you can see it here, which could indicate the Jewish kingship, at least for the model of this plate. You can see that this was erased on the other Nildin plate. It is true that during the 10th century, we have in Byzantium the Joshua roll and the scene of the capture of Jericho, which could offer a Christian parallel. There are other Byzantine caskets in ivory representing Joshua. But there is a debate among Byzantinists, and some think that the origin should be a painting chronicle of Jewish origin. Another plate, which is Christian, certainly Christian this time, but could have a Jewish origin, is representing King David singing his psalms with his prince Solomon and one of his wives to the left here. She could be Bathsheba or the Queen of Saba. The plate belongs to a very rich tradition of Jewish and Christian representations of David playing the lyre as a good shepherd in the tradition of Orpheus and prefigurating Jesus Christ. Interesting is the Sasanian posture of the king, maybe originated in Merv, like other post-Sasanian dishes, including the Al-Mamukh dish you can see here to the right. This bowl also has the animals, the celestial, the paradisiac animals all around in an alternation of vegetarian and carnivorous animals who listen peacefully what David is singing. But what is interesting is that we have here two angels in a posture of Christian prayer. So it is sure that this plate is Christian, I would say, but its model could be Jewish. In conclusion, we like to go back to Shaul Shaket's seminal work and his identification of a Jewish silver plate by inscriptions. Our inventory shows that iconography can sometimes betray a Jewish origin, in particular under the Hephthalites in Central Asia and more general after the Islamic conquest. In all cases, the silverware shows the transfer of traditions between East and West beyond religions. Thank you very much for your attention.